Welcome to this Friends at Home virtual event. My name is Karen Butter, and I'm president of the Friends of the Alameda Free Library, located in Alameda, California. We're joined today by New York author Carol Wallace. We have changed the time for this Friends at Home event since our author lives in New York, and we wanted to accommodate the time difference. Before we get started, though, I want to review technical details about the webinar. You are welcome to use the chat feature to introduce yourself. In using chat and Q&A, we ask that all participants act with respect in their comments. We are recording this event, so you will find it on our website in a few days. The audio for all audience members is muted, and the video is turned off, so you will only see Carol and me for part of the time. At any time, I encourage you to submit questions through the Q&A icon on your panel. At the end, I will read your questions to Carol, so please ask questions. And a reminder, we are far from experts with the technology, but hope to create a great experience for all of our listeners. Before I introduce our authors, I want to tell you a little about the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. As president, I'm joined by a board of 14 dedicated Alamedans. The Friends is a nonprofit organization that raises funds and advocates for an outstanding public library in Alameda. In this age of the pandemic, the library is adapting to new challenges through its new takeout service to order and obtain library materials. The Friends has been working alongside the library in ensuring that our role as advocates continues through shelter in place. From producing new virtual content to keeping the community up to date and reporting on our local librarians' work, the Friends is committed to its role as a library support organization. For the past several months, we have held a series of virtual docent and author talks that have been very popular. And we have now created an online used bookstore offering books and grab bags on our website with bike delivery on the island. A new set of books is added every week, so check out our website and please shop. While we miss getting together with our friends and supporters, our first priority is the safety of those who attend our event. These Friends at Home events provides an opportunity to connect with you and to share common experiences. We thank our supporters for their ongoing donations so that we can continue to honor our commitments to support library programs. And while we do incur expenses to provide programs like these, we ask that you consider a donation to the Friends in any amount that is comfortable for you at our website, alamedafriends.com. Now I'm delighted to introduce today's author, Carol Wallace. Carol will talk about her book, Leaving Van Gogh. Her book centers on Vincent Van Gogh's relationship with his doctor toward the end of his life. Carol is the great-great-granddaughter of Lew Wallace, author of the novel Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, which was first published in 1880 and has been updated for modern audiences by Carol. She has written more than 20 books, including most recently, Leaving Van Gogh. And she is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, To Marry an English Lord, an inspiration for Downton Abbey. She holds degrees from Princeton University and Columbia University. So now I will turn the program over to Carol.
Thank you so much, Karen. I really appreciate that. I want to make sure I'm actually sharing as I intend to be. Yes, are we good? Are you guys seeing the slide?
We're seeing the slide, Carol. You need to start. You need to start the slide show.
Okay. Oh shoot! Sorry about that, guys. There we go. Are we good?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, good. Sorry about that little technical glitch. This is my first Zoom talk. I've done a lot of these talks for this book and other ones throughout the country, so it's startling and yet strangely familiar to be talking about this book, but weird not to see any of you. Just so you guys have a sense of who I am, I grew up on the East Coast, and I live with my husband, who's also a writer, in New York City. Both of our sons are in California, one of them in San Francisco, so we've been following your weather mishaps and smoke and everything with real concern. And it's nice to be connecting with a part of the West Coast that I'm really not as familiar with. So that's really a pleasure. And I particularly wanted to thank Karen Butter for your introduction and Karen Manuel for all of your help. And I may have a glitch here when I try to, no, it's gonna work. Okay, sorry about that. And thank you also, Karen, for mentioning some of my other books so that that spares me from doing that. I have written everything ranging from baby name books, which are as boring as you can imagine, but extremely lucrative, to fiction and other kinds of how-to books. The way I came to leaving Van Gogh was sort of unusual. I had gone to Columbia University to get a master's degree in art history. And I wrote, excuse me, my master's thesis on a French printmaker named Charles Meryon, whose work this is. It's an etching of the Paris morgue, quite grim. And like Vincent Van Gogh, Meryon suffered from mental illness. Here we see him painted, drawn by a friend in a Parisian asylum. So I was sitting in the Columbia Library one day, reading up on Meryon and his various works. And it turns out that he had been visited in a Parisian insane asylum by a Dr. Gashay, whose name I recognized from this portrait, which you may remember was sold in 1990 for what was then a huge record, $82.5 million. So I was driven to do a little bit more research because it occurred to me that if the guy who visited Meryon in the asylum also was a friend of Vincent Van Gogh's, I just wanted to know more about this man who was so drawn to these two mentally ill artists. So the basic background is that Dr. Gashay went to medical school in Paris in the 1850s, but he always had friends who were either artists or collectors, and he himself was a collector. He was the family doctor for Camille Pissarro, who paid him for services, medical services in paintings. He was also a great friend to Cezanne, who painted with Dr. Gashay in the country, in a little town called Auvers, which is about an hour and 20 minutes outside of Paris by train. This is a Cezanne painting of Dr. Gashay's house, made in the early 1870s. Cezanne not only gave Dr. Gashay paintings, but he left some behind at the house, either unfinished or forgotten. And in addition, other connections with artists, Dr. Gashay had loaned money to Monet, who was consistently broke. He took care medically of one of Renoir's favorite models. And he even loaned a very important Cezanne painting to the first Impressionist exhibit in 1874 in Paris. So Dr. Gashay was at the forefront of the art world at a moment of great ferment and change. And it turns out that he was also one of the more innovative doctors in the field of mental illness at the time. So here's where I have to diverge a little bit and give you a tiny history of French psychiatry. This is a painting of a man taking the chains off a woman who has been chained up in an asylum. As late as the mid-19th century, there was nothing that we would consider to be medical care of mentally ill in Paris. Mental illness was often seen as possession. And there was very little effort made to improve the conditions of people who were suffering. So by the mid-19th century, so it's a little bit later than this period, when Dr. Gashay had done his medical training, there was a new philosophy starting to take hold that had more to do with kindness, physical care of mental illness patients who were seen as being alienated from their normal selves. It was thought that they could be returned to sanity if they were, if physical health and routine were attended to more carefully. So the two important things, the first things I knew about this Dr. Gashay were that he was involved with this, it seems so simple to us, this idea of kindly care of the mentally ill, but that was innovative, and Dr. Gashay was at the forefront there, as well as being at the forefront of his taste in painting. One of the most promising things that I found out about him is that he also had a large and controversial painting collection. When Dr. Gashay died in 1909, he owned 26 paintings by Van Gogh, 12 Pissarros, 30s by a man named Guillaumin, a Sisley, a Renoir, and a Manet. So after the doctor's death, this is his son, Paul Gashay, stayed in his father's house, curated his father's collection, and by the mid-20th century, the collection was worth a fortune. You may remember, some of you may have read Irving Stone's Lust for Life, which was published, I'm shocked to remember this because I loved that book, published in 1935. And it sort of kicked off the whole Van Gogh craze. And there was Paul Gashay, Dr. Gashay's son, in this little town, Auvers, something of a recluse, but he had this incredible collection of paintings, and he started giving them to French museums in the middle of the 20th century, and they were sort of appearing out of nowhere, and no one knew anything about them. And there were some suggestions about forgery, and there was no history to corroborate Paul Gashay's claims. So I thought at that point, I was writing a novel about Paul Gashay and his forgeries. Here's a painting of his, which he tried to pass off as a Van Gogh. It's called Auvers, from the spot where Vincent died. And it sort of looks like a Van Gogh, but if you put it up next to a real Van Gogh, you're not going to fool anybody. And it is true that Van Gogh's work was very enthusiastically forged in the early 19th century, partly because his style is so distinctive that I suppose it looks like it would be easy to copy. And the first catalog of Van Gogh's work contained as many as 30% fakes. So this seemed to be a fruitful idea about that I could work with about, I was going to have an art history student who discovered forgery, and maybe there was going to be the discovery of a new Van Gogh, and there was going to be an attractive young graduate student, and there was probably going to be a romance. And so all of this was sort of in my mind when I went to Auvers to do some research, which was going to be essential to the writing of this novel. So this is a postcard of Auvers. It's a very pretty little town, about an hour and 20 minutes outside of Paris. And as you can see, Van Gogh's residence there really makes its tourist industry. When I visited, it still felt very much like a village. You could get a sense of what it was that made it appealing to both Dr. Gashay and to Van Gogh. We'll come back to that. So I went on a beautiful May day. There was no one there. There was no one in the town. I went to the house where Vincent himself had died, only really to check the box. And I didn't expect much from it. There's what they call a lieu de mémoire, which is, I guess, a historical house. There's a bookstore and there's a restaurant. I bought a ticket to go see the garret where Van Gogh had died, and I was really just being dutiful. And the woman who sold it to me said, "Oh, you're so lucky. There's no one here. You will be up there with Van Gogh's ghost all by yourself." And I thought, oh, you must be kidding. Is that what you tell all the tourists? So I climbed these creaky wooden stairs, and there was nothing up there to see except an old bed and an old table. And then I went down the hall, and there was a slideshow of Van Gogh's work, because they have to give you something besides this sad little bedroom. And I was looking at the slides of the paintings that Van Gogh had painted in Auvers. And the door opens and a woman comes in and sits down next to me. And I'm, by that point, weeping. And then she starts to sniffle. And by the time the lights go up on this slideshow, we're both crying. And she turns and says to me, "It's too sad. It's just too sad." And that was the moment when I thought, yeah, this is not about forgery. This is about a human being who is trying to do his best under really hard circumstances to cope with life. So the next stop, obviously in Auvers, is the cemetery, which I didn't take this picture, but I could have. This is what it always looks like, apparently. Bed of ivy, very simple stones, and people bring tributes. There are little magnets and stuffed animals and balloons. People pick poppies out of the wheat fields that still surround the graveyard, and they twine them with wheat into little bouquets. So it also occurred to me that Van Gogh has inspired such devotion over so many years that he was clearly and should really be the center of this book that I was now going to write. So everything turned around right there in Auvers. And then I figured out that I had not written historical fiction before. And I realized that on the one hand, history does offer you a kind of scaffold, a structure for your plot, but on the other hand, it does limit your choices. So I couldn't have Vincent Van Gogh turn out to be a successful painter. I couldn't have him marry and have many, many children. It was going to be a tragic story, any way I sliced it. There have been several novels about Van Gogh. One that was published in 2006 suggested that Vincent had had a love affair with Dr. Gashay's daughter. And then there's another one that came out in 2009 called Sunflowers. I'm sure you all remember the episode where Vincent cut off part of his ear. And in that novel, he gives the ear to a local prostitute. Neither of these, both of these plots seemed very far-fetched to me, and I wanted to stay much closer to the facts as I knew them. So to run through a quick biography of Vincent Van Gogh, which we kind of need. This is the house, the church where his father was a rector in the Netherlands. Vincent was born in 1853 in a small town. Father, very rigorous, strict, very Protestant, buttoned up old family. And Vincent actually spent 8 years working at art dealerships in The Hague and London and Paris. He also spent some time training to become a minister, and some time as a missionary in Belgium in a coal mining location. This is clearly a man who could not settle to any particular profession, what we might call these days failure to launch. Finally, in 1881, he began devoting himself to art, which didn't particularly please his minister father. He didn't have much formal training. That never happened. And neither did he have much of a temperament to submit to formal training. So he spent the next 4 years in the Netherlands getting some rudimentary instruction and painting a very great deal. So this is one of his early paintings, and the big book is a Bible. The small yellow book is what cultured people at the time would have recognized as a French novel, which almost by definition would have been somewhat scandalous, somewhat sexual, would have related more closely to contemporary life. And it's possible to read this image as Vincent making a choice between the Bible of his youth and the novel, which reflects the real life that he saw all around them. In 1886, his younger brother Theo, who was at that point an art dealer in Paris, urged Vincent to go to Paris and pursue his painting ambitions there, which were very different from what was going on in the Netherlands. The Impressionists in particular had altered the palette. Here we're seeing a lot of brown and yellow, and right away, once Vincent gets to Paris, his palette lightens up, brightens up. We see the sort of dashing brushwork, the statue of Venus, the roses, and these two novels are both quite licentious. Bel Ami is a novel about a serial seducer, for example. So this is Vincent proclaiming what his new world is going to be. He worked really, really hard in that period of the 1880s and produced more than 200 paintings. And then he moved south to Arles in the south of Paris. He was still, when he worked at a kind of feverish pace, really, really quickly. And he's still working that hard when the famous sunflower pictures start to appear. He starts to focus on the southern, again, the southern palette of Arles. And the famous episode with the ear dates from around this era. He was spending a lot of time with Gauguin. They were very competitive with each other. It was not a good situation. And he begins to have, at this point, mental symptoms. Again, we don't know exactly what. Maybe hallucinations, maybe some depression. There's the episode where he cuts off the ear, and that precipitated his checking himself into an asylum in Saint-Rémy, also in the south of France, where he spent a year. And he painted when he could, when he felt mentally stable enough to do that. Then finally in May of 1890, he left the asylum to go back to Auvers in the northwest of France, where Dr. Gashay had a weekend house. And the idea was that Gashay, who had been very interested in mental concerns, would supervise Vincent as Vincent continued to work. To go back to the historical record, again, I couldn't have predicted this when I was starting to write this novel, but I had just stumbled onto one of the best documented artists' lives in history, thanks to Van Gogh's correspondence, of which this is one example. There are about 819 surviving letters. I say about because some of them are not necessarily, some of them are forgeries. 651 of those letters were written to Theo, and Theo kept them, which is part of the reason we have so much information about Van Gogh. And I would like you to keep an eye out. You see that image at the bottom of the page there, that's a sketch for the portrait of Dr. Gashay that you've already seen that we'll come back to. So at this point, Vincent is entirely supported by his long-suffering brother, Theo, who lives in an apartment in Montmartre in Paris with his wife and a little boy, little baby. And it is Theo who is now entirely supporting Vincent. And he's providing Vincent's painting materials, which, I mean, you can imagine, you've seen the images. There's a lot of paint on those canvases, and that's not cheap. So Vincent, while he felt that Theo was a partner in his painting, that's part of the reason these letters are so numerous and so explicit, is that he felt that Theo was really a partner in the painting project. So he writes about what he's painted and what he's seen and what he's read and what he's working on. And as a result, we know pretty much moment for moment where Vincent was and what he was doing for a very great amount of time. And in fact, this is so poignant, there was an unfinished letter to Theo in Vincent's pocket when he died. Because of course, he did die, we all know that. This is a drawing of Vincent on his deathbed by Dr. Gashay. It was sent to Theo and dated on July 29th, 1890, which is obviously the day Vincent died. So the story of Vincent Van Gogh's last summer, which he spent largely with Dr. Gashay, turned out to be a story about oncoming death. And it became clear to me as I was researching this and still thinking about where I might find a novel in all this story, that it was Vincent's death, Vincent's suicide, that was going to have to drive the narrative tension. At the same time, the book is narrated by the doctor, which is a choice I made. And in a way, Vincent's loquaciousness on paper drove that decision because his voice was so strong, whereas we didn't hear much from the doctor. So I could invent a voice for Dr. Gashay. I had a lot more freedom for my imagination, working from his point of view. But naturally, from the beginning, there were episodes of this friendship that I was going to want to fit in. Obviously, one of them was the moment where Van Gogh paints Dr. Gashay, and I wanted it to mirror that with a moment where Dr. Gashay, as a doctor, examines Vincent. So those two moments are sort of a mutual or a reflective diagnosis. So to back up a little bit, when you're writing historical fiction, and as I said, this was my first time doing this, the facts guide you and prompt you, but you still have to transform the protagonists from being historical figures into characters who, for you, are living and breathing people. And the moment when I really knew who Van Gogh was a story about when he was living with Theo in a very small apartment in Montmartre. This is the door, 54 is the door of the building that they lived in, which is still there. And then to the right, we see a drawing Vincent made of the rooftops of Montmartre. So the story that brought Vincent to life for me was that they would have these heated discussions about painting. Vincent and Theo would. Theo's working for an art dealer, so he's obviously got a more conservative point of view. And Vincent would get stuck on a point and keep arguing. And poor Theo's got to go to work in the morning, so he's going to bed. And Vincent would pull up a chair, put it next to his brother's bed, and continue to argue. And I thought, oh, that's who that guy is. He's that guy who just won't shut up. So pairing that with the sort of incredibly sensitive patient and well-intentioned fellow who wrote many of those letters, gave me a good rounded sense of who that man was. With Dr. Gashay, it was a little harder to build an actual person since he left very many fewer traces. But I do like this. He was a man who loved a costume. So here he is in his military. They had to do military service in France in those days. And I think he quite fancied how dashing he looked in his uniform there. And for me, however, the detail that really captured who Dr. Gashay was is that he planted sunflowers by Vincent's grave after Vincent died. Thoughtful, sentimental, any of us might have done the same thing. And then there's another source, of course, for me, there was another source of information as I was writing this book, which is the paintings themselves. Vincent's period of the greatest productivity is 1880 to 1890. And it's a period when the French painting establishment is very, very conservative. On the right, there's a painting by Gogh, very, very well thought of. He sold really well. And this, I think it has to be Venus. I'm not quite sure. And all these cupids, and you can see the detail, the way the flesh kind of gleams. There's no sense of a brush having been anywhere near it. Contrast that with the Van Gogh painting, which is all about, here I was, here's what my brush did, here's how I feel, which I think we sense from that glare of the eyes and the greenness and the strangely distorted color and the distorted shape of his head. It's very dramatic. So, it's spring of 1890, and Vincent is in an asylum in Saint-Rémy in the south of France. And this is a cypress tree that he had painted. He painted a lot in the asylum. He had committed himself to spend a year there in the hope that he would be able to return to some kind of mental health. And this is after the famous episode where he cut off his ear. So he was allowed to paint at Saint-Rémy, so that was okay. It was all he really cared about. But he felt that the other patients there, who were even more ill than he was, kept him from getting well. So he wanted to leave the asylum. Dr. Gashay felt that he shouldn't go back to Paris because it was too stimulating. And Theo had the idea of asking Dr. Gashay if Vincent could move to Auvergne, and Dr. Gashay would, at that point, be able to keep an eye on him. So Pissarro, and it was Pissarro who made the link between Gashay and Theo. So this is the place to say that we do not actually know exactly the nature of Vincent's illness. This is his own painting. And it seems clear that what he's done here is make a portrait of one of the guys who was in the asylum at Saint-Rémy, and then basically just take his hands to the head and smear the wet paint, which is so descriptive and completely unprecedented in painting technique. So it exudes suffering, and it gave me a lot of sympathy for Van Gogh trying to manage his mental illness under these really difficult circumstances. We cannot diagnose exactly what was wrong with him. The mental illness categories of the time do not match up with ours. He may have been epileptic. There was a kind of cyclical nature to his illness. He may well have been bipolar. There are strong arguments to be made for that. He was restrained sometimes in the asylum. There was very, very little treatment. Of course, they had none of the medications we have. Even talk therapy did not exist in those days. A facility for the mentally ill was basically a holding pen. They were sometimes given cold baths, sometimes they were restrained. There was really very little way to get better. So all this time, again, Vincent is writing to Theo in a strikingly lucid way. Here's just an excerpt that I find piercingly sad. I'm in good health, he's writing from Saint-Rémy in June of 1989. I feel happier with my work here than I could outside. By staying here a fairly long time, I will have acquired controlled behavior. And in the long run, the result will be more order in my life and a little less impressionability. And that would be something gained. Besides, I wouldn't have the courage to begin again. I once went into the village, accompanied at that, and the mere sight of the people and things had an effect on me as if I was going to faint, and I felt very ill. So I'm going to whip through some of Van Gogh's own images now that kind of recap this late phase of his life. This is the inn, obviously not a Van Gogh image, the inn where he lived in this town called Auvergne, and it's still there. There's a restaurant there. It's called the Auberge Ravoux. It's delightful. In May of 1890, this is where Vincent arrived, and he had a room upstairs. He was super excited to be someplace where chestnuts bloomed, where the milder, greener, damper climate gave him all kinds of exciting new subjects to think about and to portray. This is a painting of Dr. Gashay's daughter, Marguerite, in the garden behind their house. So remember, the novel is narrated from the point of view of the doctor, and he writes a great deal about, his records include a great deal about the garden, and there are studies about Marguerite, who was an impressionable young woman. There is a painting of Vincent that Van Gogh made of Marguerite playing the piano. I think it was his first exposure to a genteel upper middle class girl, and he was quite enchanted, although probably not. I think there was a sort of hands-off feeling as well. So during the summer of 1890, which the last summer of Vincent Van Gogh's life, he's painting furiously, almost a painting a day, stacking them up, letting them dry. They're all wet, they're all drying all over the place. He's also fascinated by portraiture, the idea of making portraits. So he asks Dr. Gashay to sit for him. And this, again, is the very famous painting that I showed you earlier. I wanted to pause here for a moment because there are bits in it that are particular to Dr. Gashay, sort of a compliment. The yellow books are novels that Dr. Gashay had read that were very well known at the time, and that Vincent and the doctor had spoken about. The flowers are, I believe they're foxgloves, also, which I think was used as a kind of calming agent at the time. And the greatest compliment of all, I don't know if you can see it on your screens, but there's a little tiny red thread in the top buttonhole of that jacket, which denotes the Legion of Honor, which is the greatest civic honor given to French citizens. And Dr. Gashay had received that and was very, very proud of it. So it's a very flattering portrait in some ways. Here's what Vincent had to say about it to Theo. What I am most passionate about is the modern portrait. I seek it by way of color. I would like to do portraits which would look like apparitions to people a century later, which frankly, I think this does tick that box. I don't try to do photographic resemblance, but our passionate expressions using intensification of the character, our science, and modern taste for color. Thus, the portrait of Dr. Gashay shows you a face the color of an overheated and sun-scorched brick with a reddish head of hair, a white cap, blue background of hills, and his suit is ultramarine blue. That brings out the face and makes it paler despite the brick color. The hands are the hands of an obstetrician, and it's true that Dr. Gashay had also delivered babies at one point. In a letter to Gauguin, Van Gogh said he's painting the doctor with, quote, the heartbroken expression of our times. So when you go to Auvers, they have what they call a Van Gogh Trail, which shows you the various locations where he painted and what he painted on each spot. And the town is still surrounded by wheat fields. In addition to the little museum where Van Gogh died, Dr. Gashay's house is also a historic site. There isn't much in it, but the garden has been reconstructed. And the church here is one of Van Gogh's most important paintings, and you can go see and stand just where Van Gogh stood to paint it. For many years, this painting was considered to be Van Gogh's final canvas. And it is deeply, deeply ominous, partly because the horizon line is so high that it blocks your view. You can't see beyond what could be beyond there. And also those darkening clouds, they're descending from the top. And then finally, you have those diverging paths which seem to go nowhere, and the crows, which are coming right at you. Your options are foreclosed, and it's just, the whole thing is quite menacing, which makes it in some ways entirely appropriate for those days. I want to end with this image because it's more cheerful, and also because this is the image that was used for the cover of Leaving Van Gogh. It was painted for the birth of Theo Van Gogh's son, who was named Vincent. And it's expressive of such tenderness, a tenderness that seems largely missing from Vincent's own life. I want to leave you with one sentence from the letters, which was written to Theo in March of 1888. It is my constant hope that I am not working for myself alone, and I believe in the absolute necessity of a new art of color, of drawing, and of the artistic life. And if we work in that faith, it seems to me that there is a chance that our hopes won't be in vain. As you all know, Vincent killed himself. He shot himself with a revolver. No one has discovered to this day where that revolver came from. There has been a suggestion that he did not kill himself, that he was shot by someone else. There's controversy over where the bullet went in. Was it in his chest? Was it in his stomach? He did not die for 2 days. And he's buried in that small cemetery in Auvers, and that's where you can go see him. So I'm going to stop now, and I'm going to stop sharing. Or maybe, Karen, David, can I leave it like this with this picture and my highlight while I take the questions? What happens now? I'm going to close that. So do we have any questions? Is someone, can you all hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now, Carol.
Okay, so I'm done. That's
okay. Yeah, we've got some questions for you. So thank you for a very interesting presentation. Remind us, how old was Vincent when he died?
I think he was 37.
And do you know how many paintings he painted during his lifetime?
Oh gosh, now that I should know, but I do not. I don't. I wouldn't care to mislead you on that.
Okay. You talked about the letters. Are those published letters? Did you have to go to an archive to see them?
They are published. There's a very, very fine edition 3 volumes, which is on my shelf, and heavily illustrated. The scholarship's great. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam is at the forefront of a lot of this Van Gogh scholarship, and they, I think, were crucial in putting that out.
And are the letters written in French or in Dutch or?
Most of them are in French, though I worked with a translation into English.
We have a question. Where was Vincent when he painted Starry Night, the north or the south?
That's a southern painting. He was in Saint-Rémy at that point. I think something about that southern sky, you see more of the light.
And Mark wants to know, what's the name of that last painting that you had up?
You know, I think it's just called, Cherry Blossoms, but I couldn't really tell you.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It is lovely, isn't it? Yeah. It's a kind of peaceful image. It's so unlike the rest of his work.
And was his art recognized during his lifetime?
Absolutely not. He never sold a painting.
He never sold a painting?
No, no. It was so different from the standards of the time that it just was not anything anybody wanted.
Wow.
Yeah.
So he really didn't get any money, financial support from his work.
No, no, nor any success, any sense of doing well. You know, he was lacking that entirely.
Yeah. Karen asks, when did his paintings become popular?
They started to become more popular as I would say in the 1920s, as kind of Cubism broke in, as representation of the world that we see became less important. That's when Vincent's pictures began to become more popular.
Did he paint when he was in the asylum?
He did. He did. And some of those paintings are very disturbing indeed. And he wasn't always able to paint. There's a lot of, some of the letters from the asylum are just heartbreaking. You have the sense of this scattered mind and the depression, and it's very vivid and really, really sad.
So you can kind of tell the difference between the time that he was in the asylum when he was painting and when he was not? Absolutely.
You absolutely can, yeah. And it's unusual, I think, to have that that vivid sense of someone. You can tell sort of when he's going off the rails and when he's sort of feeling better, and it's a really vivid view into severe mental illness.
Mm-hmm. Karen also wants to know, did his brother ever profit from his paintings as an art dealer?
Oh, yes, he did. Yes, Theo did very well with his paintings and tried to place them quite carefully so that they didn't. I think Theo, as a dealer, was able to make sure that they didn't all hit the market at once or whatever. But yes, Theo did. And I don't think they were all sold right away. You know, I think he sort of spun them out, but I don't really know about that process.
And how long did Theo live?
Gosh, I should know that answer, and I do not.
But a lot longer than Van Gogh.
You know, it was longer, but not that much longer. Theo, if I remember correctly, well, you know what? One of those, the slide of those two gravestones would tell us. Actually, I can look at that right now and tell you that Theo. No, I'm not going to keep you waiting. He died maybe 10 years after Vincent, so quite young. And I think Theo died, as so many did at that time, of tuberculosis.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then David asked, the portrait of Dr. Gautier sold for millions, is that right?
That is correct. So the one I showed you sold for $82.2 million in 1990. And it was at that point, far and away, the most valuable painting ever, the most expensive, the highest price paid for a painting. It has since then, I mean, that's a while ago. It has since then been completely eclipsed in terms of the price paid for it.
And is that the highest price for a Van Gogh that's been paid to date?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. One thing that's sort of fascinating about it is that it was sold to a Japanese collector. And if I am remembering correctly, we don't know where it is. It has vanished from view.
Somebody said that, Zoraida said that Theo died 6 months after his brother.
Ooh. Ooh, that is so sad. Thank you. Thank you for looking that up. I really appreciate that. That is super tragic. Imagine Theo's wife, who had a son, who had a baby, Vincent. Just all of that grief. So.
Right. David asked, did you invent Theo's affliction with pox, or was it historically factual?
Theo's. Did I say Theo? Yeah.
David said Theo. I don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, honestly, I don't remember. It's a long time ago. I don't think I would have made that I wouldn't have made that up. So I suspect that's real. He probably, yeah. But again, I can't swear to that.
Right. So another question said, or just a comment, that then if his brother died within 6 months, he probably was not able to benefit from selling any paintings.
Probably true. And if I remember correctly, yeah, I don't know. That's, as I said, that's gone.
Right.
Gone in my mind.
Somebody also said that she likes that you have sunflowers in the vase behind you.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad you noticed. It's a complete coincidence. My son sends me flowers sometimes, and they happened this time to be sunflowers. So what you don't see is the back of the arrangement where all the dead ones got taken out already.
So how can we get your book?
Well, unfortunately, the book itself is out of print. So if you want to read it, I highly recommend the Alameda Free Library, which probably has a copy, or any library. You can apparently still get it for a Kindle, and I know that some libraries do loan e-copies. And I hate to say this, but you could probably get a secondhand copy pretty easily at your favorite library book sale, perhaps.
Right. I also want to remind our viewers in Alameda that they can also get the Kindle, I suspect, or the ebook through Books Inc., the local bookstore. So,
oh, good. Mm-hmm. Great.
So can you talk a little bit? I was interested in the introduction. You talked about updating Ben-Hur. How do you update Ben-Hur?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's more recent, so I have a much more vivid memory of it. Has any of you attendees tried to read the old Ben-Hur? Because it is terrible, really dull. It's clunky. He was my great-great-grandfather, so I owe him respect, but a writer he was not. And the pacing is really, really slow. Oh my gosh, the dialogue is just terrible. So that was pretty easy, actually. It's one of my favorite things I've ever done, because plot's great, characters are a little shallow, but okay, fine. There's a lot going on. And it was pure pleasure to do that, because all I had to do was, it was more like a translation than anything else. So I translated it from stodgy 1880 prose to more accessible current prose.
So you were able to, that then was not in copyright, so you didn't have any issues about getting the copyright.
Exactly.
Because it was before 21 or whatever.
Exactly. And so now the version that's out there is copyrighted in my name, which I think is kind of hilarious.
Okay. You're working on a new book now?
Well, in fact, I just sent my newest novel to the editor yet again for the umpteenth revision. It is scheduled for publication in November 2021, and I have this 19th century sort of fixation. So this one is set in New York in the 1870s, and it's about social climbing in New York after the Civil War, when there was a ton of new money flooding into the city, and it's called Our Kind of People.
And so how did you do the research?
Well, you know, there's that funny thing, the internet. I have done previous books, which were big 19th century things that involved a trip to New York Public Library and lots of ferreting through old newspapers. But, you know, all of that's been digitized. So one of the things, for example, is there's a plot point about an elevated railway. So you wouldn't believe how much information there is. I found somebody's PhD thesis about elevated railways in New York City. So I basically sat here at my desk, as you see, and traveled back in time. It was fun.
Can you talk a little bit about the book that was based upon, or you said was based upon Downton Abbey? How did that happen?
In fact, let me just grab, oh, here. Book jacket. Very pretty book jacket, actually. That one I co-wrote with a friend, and it dates from, I'm gonna say 89. Yeah, that's right. Copyrighted 1989. We started out writing about, it's about American women who married English aristocrats at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And most of it takes place in either New York or England, obviously. And the reason, for example, that this new edition exists is that Julian Fellows somehow got hold of it. And there was an article after the first season of Downton Abbey, there was an article in, I think, the English Daily Telegraph, in which Julian said he'd been getting pressure from his producers to write a new series. And he had just read this book, and he thought, gosh, wouldn't it be interesting to figure out what happened to those American girls who married English aristocrats once they got to England and everything was different. So that's Cora. Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, that was a life-changing event when Julian made that statement and the book was put back into print, and I did a lot of talking, and I did a tour of England, and it was crazy and super fun.
So I'm sure that the sales of the book just took off.
Took off. New printing, thousands and thousands of copies sold. Great.
And I have a comment from Carol, who said, I enjoy hearing your thinking and decision-making as a writer in the evolution of your new book.
Oh, thank you. That's very nice. Thank you.
I think that's all the questions that I have for you, Carol. So
thank you.
Thank you. It was really a great introduction.
Well, good. I really enjoyed doing this. And I have a lot of respect for, I grew up next door to a library, actually. So you are my people. This was really fun. I enjoyed being here with all of you and with all of the people out there, your other people.
Well, thank you for your really interesting talk and the background on Van Gogh, and we certainly learned a lot. And I also want to thank everybody for attending our event. and to Carol for the delightful program and opportunity to learn more about Van Gogh. And as I said, while Van Gogh is out of print, it's still available as an ebook or audiobook. So please remember our local bookstore if you want to purchase anything. Now for a few announcements. On September 30th at 7 p.m., Marilyn Chase will discuss her new book, Everything She Touched, The World of Ruth Asawa. And we will hear about the art exhibit, The Last Supper in Pompeii on October 14th, which is scheduled to open at some point at the Legion of Honor. Please join us by registering for future events through the events tab at alamedafriends.com. And please consider a donation to the Friends of the Alameda Free Library that will allow us to continue to sponsor events such as these. Finally, thanks to those who helped make this happen, David Beal and Karen Manuel for managing Zoom and registration. Thanks again to our outstanding speaker, Carol Wallace, and thank you, our audience, for joining us at Friends at Home.